And we are back with more on News Talk Saga 960. So very glad you could join us on this edition of the Mark Petrona Show. Well, there's a lot of buzz going around in terms of Canada's possible role in training extremist groups, namely a Nazi affiliated group in Ukraine that's involved in fighting the Russians at the moment, the notorious Azov unit. By now, probably many of you have already heard about this. The story is that members of the notorious Ukrainian far right, well, let's call it a Nazi unit, a battalion, had access to training provided by the Canadian military. And that was reported by Radio Canada. They reported that this week. Photos taken during military training by the Canadian Armed Forces in Western Ukraine. Now, we're going back to 2020. In fact, this story was actually found its way into the pages of the Ottawa Citizen. This was in November of 2021. And it shows members of the neo-Nazi division, now normally part of the Ukrainian government's battalion of troops, participated in drills. And one of the Ukrainian soldiers in that photo even wears a patch of the 14th Division of the Waffen SS. So these guys are serious, okay? They proudly call themselves Nazis. They're not interested in hiding the fact. It's who they are. And so the question is, are Canadian taxpayers involved in, I don't know, maybe bankrolling the training of some of these people? And I say, who better to talk about that than Tom Quiggin, of course, who's an expert in the field of military intelligence. He's a court-appointed expert in things like Islamic terror. He's a published author of some renown and a guy that we go to whenever stories like this rear their heads. Welcome once again, Tom.
Hello again, Mark. Always interesting to join you on some of the more, shall we say, difficult and challenging stories of the day.
Well, this one has some people buzzing because we all know, of course, that Justin Trudeau has come out and say, hey, we got to support the Ukrainians. We got to beat back Putin. He's a bad guy. And so here we have this invasion by the Russians. And of course, one of the pretexts given by Putin said, we got to denazify Ukraine, that this is a serious problem, that there are some hardcore Nazis taking part in the governing of Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons that we have to go in there. That's what Putin fed as part of the justification for the invasion to begin with. And so people laugh that off and say, well, no, wait a minute. That's bogus. That's entirely untrue, that this was just an act of aggression by Putin on the people of Ukraine, wanting to gain back some of the territory that the old Soviet Union used to have, as you well know. And I know it. Going back to prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was just a power grab, a land grab by Putin. But lo and behold, now we have some reports now, whether it's Russian disinfo or not, where Canada has been involved in training people who either were in this unit, in this battalion, that's Nazi battalion. I don't even know why Ukraine has this group in its midst. I mean, why? I mean, surely, the negative PR from having something like that is enough to dissuade them from having these guys participate in any kind of activities. But here it is now, reports that Canada was involved in training some of these guys. What do you make of this stuff, Tom?
It's an incredibly complex story, Mark, with a lot of background behind it. First off, let's just look at the Nazi thing, the National Socialist thing, if you will. Ukraine, as a country, has a rather long and unfortunate history of association with the Nazis going back to essentially World War II. Prior to the Nazi or the German invasion of Ukraine, there were Nazi organizations operating in Ukraine that were openly pro-Hitler, pro-Germany, et cetera, et cetera. And part of that, of course, was that they were Ukrainians who were anti-Soviet, they were anti-communist, they were anti-Russia. So they would latch onto and support anything that they thought would give them a leg up against Moscow. For instance, our own deputy prime minister and current finance minister, her grandfather was a card-carrying Ukrainian Nazi. And I mean, I'm not saying anything outrageous here. This has been in the press numerous times. And she tried to hide that for a bunch of years. But he was a card-carrying Nazi, not because he was forced into it or it was politically convenient, but before the invasion, he'd run a pro-Nazi newspaper in Ukraine. So the history is there. During World War II, once Ukraine was invaded, a lot of Ukrainians supported the Nazis. A lot of Ukrainians fought them. So it divided the country badly. whatever it is, the history of Nazis in Ukraine kind of continued along. It became part of the folklore, part of the culture, part of the resistance to the Soviet Union. Whereas in other countries, such as Germany or Austria, I mean, anything even vaguely resembling Nazis got like stamped out quite badly. So the sort of history is there. Now, to look at this, I mean, it's so hard. It's such a hyper partisan environment right now. It's so hard to say anything in kind of a rational way. But let's move back to 2004, 2014 in there, where Russia is putting the moves on Ukraine. They were, they eventually took over Crimea. They've taken over parts of the Donbass. The West, of course, did nothing to help Ukraine while that was happening, other than they made a few, nonsensical comments about, they're going to put a few sanctions and this kind of stuff or whatever. But one of the few groups in Ukraine who is actually physically fighting on the ground in the Donbass area to try and drive the Russian influence out was this Azov battalion or regiment, depending whatever you want to call it. Different people give it a different name. It's not like it's a formed unit of the Ukrainian army. Think of it more as, I don't know, for people who remember the Yugoslav War, think of it more as like Arkan's Tigers, which were a hyper-nationalist Bosnian Serb outfit that would go around committing like some of the most horrible atrocities. They looked like a military unit. They wore uniforms. They had badges. They wore hats. They dressed up like the military. They had a rank structure like the military. They used military names for their operations, but they weren't actually a functioning part of the Bosnian Serb or the Serbian Serb military. So think of the Azovs kind of along that range. Now, it's not like their Nazi history and affiliation has been hidden. If you go back through, say, the Guardian newspaper 3 or 4 years before this current invasion and war even started, the Guardian was running all kinds of like horribly critical articles about Zelensky and about the Azovs and affiliation with Nazis. And there's pictures of guys standing there with an actual World War II style swastika flag, guys wearing SS insignia, and people who are making references and color codes and banners back to the Nazis of the World War II era. So this isn't like something sudden. It's not something shocking. It's not, something that's just been exposed. It's been known for years. Now, okay, so the actual question you're asking is, did the Canadian government, willfully or otherwise, wind up training these characters? So my sense of what I've been watching over the last several years as this was going on is, Canada did not send military personnel to train the Azov battalion, because I think most Canadian military guys really hate Nazis. It's like the kind of stuff we don't like. But if you look at it a different way and say, did a bunch of guys in the Ukrainian army receive training from Canada and from multiple other NATO countries? The answer is absolutely yes, they did. Did we do this for a number of years? Absolutely, we did. And was it like tactical on the ground training? Yeah, that's what we were doing. So if the question arises, did some of these guys go to the Ukrainian army to get training and then slide over to the Azov battalion? The answer is entirely, quite possibly, yes. We see this in America. We see it in Canada. We see it in Germany on occasion. People will join their local military, Canada, America, whatever, to get the training, to get the skills, to get the tactics. And they go off and join some nut bar militia or some nut bar terrorist group or whatever. And that goes on, unfortunately, not a lot in Canada, but it's happened. It happens quite a bit in America, and it's happened in Germany and a few other countries. So did Canada train the Azov battalion? No, we probably didn't. However, having said that, is there cross-pollination of the training between the Ukrainian army and the Azov? Yeah, very, very possibly it is, Mark. But again, complicated story with a lot of history. And right now in this hyper-partisan environment, you're not allowed to say anything. And it's particularly ironic here in Canada, where anybody the government doesn't like is a Nazi. The convoy is Nazi. Rebel media is run by Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. And now here we have an unfortunate thing where the guys we're calling the good guys, the Ukrainians, have a formed unit which is regularly fighting that runs around flying actual swastikas.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. But you would think that our military, our government, through our Defense Department, would take precautions and say to the Ukrainians, look, we're happy to support you and help you with money, with training, but we don't want to have any association with these Nazi units. Okay, can you make sure that none of our support goes to them? You would think that those discussions would happen. I mean, as you said yourself. I mean,
but Mark, I mean,
that's too much.
That's the kind of thing that's impossible. I mean, here in Canada, we probably have a much better screening system for the military than the Ukrainians do. We don't have a conscript system and all that kind of stuff. But even in the Canadian forces, we wind up with the odd idiot who's got some ideology that they've managed to hide or whatever. So to go to something like Ukraine and say, we'll train, 10,000 guys, but you got to guarantee us none of them will go crazy later or become ideological later. Almost impossible kind of to guarantee. So it's just one of those things. If you involve yourself in foreign lands that have complicated histories with, multiple border disputes, whatever, no matter where you go, no matter what you touch, no matter who you involve yourself with, you're going to wind up in trouble. If we went back to Bosnia now to try and train, any one of the three main armies they've got operating inside Bosnia, you're going to wind up dealing with bad people. There's just no two ways around it. Same thing goes for anywhere. I mean, that whole area of Eastern Europe has just an absolutely bloody long history with some of the most horrific things that have happened in the past and some of the most vicious ideologies in play. No matter who you work with over there, you're going to get dirty fingers, Mark.
Well, there's this story. Since 2014, the government of Canada has invested more than $700 million in the training of the Ukrainian military. That's a lot of money. I can't verify those numbers, but this appears to be a reputable number. So we're going back to the Harper years. Ukrainian militiamen from the neo-Nazi Azov battalion would have participated in training programs organized by Ottawa. So maybe it's a bit of a stretch here, where the suggestion is that because all this money went in to the training of the Ukrainian military, and part of that money may have been funneled to this neo-Nazi unit, ergo, we're supporting Nazis. So that's
here's a comparison, Mark.
Yeah.
We spent a whole bunch of years in Afghanistan. I think the Canadian forces were there eventually, 14 years, 15 years, or whatever it was. And the Canadian government and NATO and a whole bunch of other governments dumped hundreds of billions of dollars into that mission, whether it was ammunition, medical supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, training, whatever. And we were supposed to be creating this new modern Afghan army that was going to be, democratic, and it's going to obey the Geneva Conventions and all this good stuff. Part of the problem was, as anybody that paid any attention to this at the time, and then we kind of found out with the collapse of Afghanistan last year, is that some of the so-called Afghan battalions, even up to the regimental level, were ghost regiments. In other words, there was nothing there. We paid all this money for training. We paid all this money for equipment. We paid all this money for salaries, and there was nothing actually there. The entire thing was a ghost. So not saying the same thing happened in Ukraine, but let's face it, Ukraine isn't the best organized country in the world. It's recognized as the most corrupt country in Europe, and that's, by Eastern European standards.
Yeah. And
it's the poorest country in Europe, notwithstanding, some pretty stiff competition from Greece and, a few other places. So is corruption there? Yeah. Do things happen there? Yeah, they do. But again, like I just said earlier, if the Canadian government has the objective of shoring up Ukraine to make it stronger against Russia, if you go in there, you're going to deal with some pretty strange people, Mark. Same thing in Bosnia. I mean, we were supposed to be there. I mean, when I was on the ground there, you're supposed to be viewing humanitarian stuff and safe areas and all this. But in order to do anything effectively at all, you wind up dealing with warlords. And I use that term, I think in the correct sense of the term, that these are outside of military control, but they've got huge amounts of guns and power, and you either deal with them or you don't. And if you don't deal with them, you can't get anything done. So when, Canadians say, oh, well, we should train people in Ukraine or Georgia or I don't know, who knows where next, Lebanon or something like that. Yeah, we can do it. Yeah, it can be partially effective. But this idea that somehow it's all going to be clean and pure and shiny, the real world doesn't work that way.
What do you make of reports that America is actually running the war in Ukraine for the Ukrainians? They've essentially gone in there. But there's been an account by a French journalist who came back and said, yeah, well, it's America's war now, that they are in the thick of it, training, doing strategy, running, who goes where and how dangerous is that if in fact it's true?
Yeah. Well, again, this gets into another. You keep asking all these questions that have these wonderful gray areas in them. The world likes black and white. It likes short headlines, but the reality in the ground is always messy. We saw the same thing in the former Yugoslavia, where the Croatian army was, at the end of the day, a wholly formed subsidiary of the U.S. military, training, operations, everything. I've seen, loads of evidence that the American military, or the defense structure writ large, was initially providing a ton of intelligence into Ukraine. In other words, like satellite imagery, signals intelligence, that sort of stuff that can tell you where movements are occurring. Clearly, some of it's been effective, because the Ukrainians, even though they're outgunned and outmanned, have been able to carry out a series of fairly effective defensive maneuvers, I think partly because of a limited amount of skill in their own part. I mean, they do have some skills, partly because of good intelligence, and partly just because the Russians have done such a miserable job to start with. But as the war goes on, you can see there's an increasingly large amount of involvement from the outside. And it's not coming that much from, say, Germany, which you would think would be a little more involved, or France. It's been mostly the United Kingdom and America seem to be the two powers that are pushing most heavily into directing Ukraine into how they can manage the problem. And I suspect if you're Ukraine, any help from the outside right now is good help, and you're going to take whatever you can get.
All right. Tom Quiggin joining us on Saga 960. And I wanted to ask you about some other issues that have come up. I know these are stories that have been on your radar screen, Tom, having to do with the vaccines and the lack of public debate over the science. And I mean, there's a sense that the government has a monopoly on the science, and also they cherry pick which science they're just going to listen to versus the science that they're not going to listen to, not only on vaccines, but now, of course, they're looking at bringing back the mandates. A lot more talk now. Mask mandates are coming back. This is partly due, and we warned about this on this show, once Shanghai went nuts and they brought in these horrific lockdowns. We've all seen the pictures of people screaming from their apartment towers, asking for food, begging. And just it's a humanitarian nightmare. Of course, much of the Western media has turned a blind eye because it's China, and of course they can't say anything. And you won't hear a word peep out of it from our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But talk a little bit about the squelching of the debate and how people like Dr. Malone, who has long been on the side of warning people about the efficacy and the safety of these vaccines, now challenged openly, targeted in hit pieces in major newspapers in the United States, in cases where even Canadian physicians and experts, so-called experts, have been quoted challenging these people to debates, and somehow these debates don't seem to happen. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a fun thing going on here with the vaccines, of course. I mean, we've known for quite a while that we've got, sort of the government position and big pharma's position on the vaccines where, they're 100% safe, they're effective. You should be not only double vaccinated, but triple and quadruple vaccinated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then, of course, on the other side of the debate, you have a number of doctors, scientists, statisticians, people who are looking at this and say, look, you should be skeptical here. This is a brand new technology. It wasn't really tested effectively. And there's plenty of evidence to say that you should be vaccine hesitant. And it's worth noting that guys like Dr. Malone aren't they're not anti-vaxxers. They're just very skeptical about this new technology. So like I said here, I mean, like you were pointing out, here in Canada and in other governments, we're keep being told that, we need more mandates, we need vaccine regulations, the lockdowns are effective. And of course, when challenged on these issues, they always fall back to the same position. Well, that's what the doctors told us. We're driven by the science. We only follow the science. And of course, clearly there's something not quite right, because you have, a jurisdiction over here that says it's following the science, say Florida, and it tends to be quite open, quite free. They're looking at a variety of early treatments, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have, by contrast, Ontario or Quebec, where they're incredibly restrictive. They don't allow early treatment. They don't allow off-label use of drugs, but both of them swear up and down they're following the science. So an interesting thing has just happened in Canada, and strangely enough, it's the New York Times that started it. The New York Times ran what I think you could politely call a hit piece on Dr. Robert Malone. Now, he's one of the 7 or 8 people who was initially involved, I think it was like 30 years ago, when they first started getting into the mRNA stuff. So I don't think it's fair to say he invented it, but it's clear to say he was there at ground zero when the stuff was being invented and tested, etc. And he's skeptical on this. He says there's good reasons to challenge the debate, and we should be taking a serious look at it. So the New York Times did this piece, and it's essentially a hit piece where they just sort of run him into the ground, etc., etc. One of the people quoted is a woman by the name of Dr. Angela Rasmussen from Saskatchewan. She's from the University of Saskatchewan Veterinary Institute, which is reputed to be like a serious outfit, like it's a top research institute, etc., etc. So she actually has on her Twitter feed called him a grifter. And in the article, I mean, they run him down to the lowest. So here's where the story starts to get interesting. Enter a guy by the name of Steve Kirsch. He's an American. He's a tech guy. Excuse me. He's worth a bunch of money. Nobody's quite sure what, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, he's super rich. So he can afford to do stuff and not have to worry about whether he's criticized or not because, you know, he's independently rich. He starts out as pro-research, pro-medtech, pro-vaccine or whatever. And then he starts saying, look, the numbers don't add up. When you look at what big government is saying, what big pharma is saying, and then you look at the stats coming out of the hospitals, whatever, he says, something's not quite right. And he's a numbers guy. He's a business guy. He says, this isn't working. So he has put up on numerous occasions between $1 million and $5 million saying to people, if you will come to a public debate with me and Dr. Malone, we'll pay you $1 million for 4 hours of your time. He made the same offer to Governor Newsom of California, who many people believe was badly vaccine injured. He says, put up your medical records, send your doctors. I'll put $5 million up to the charity of your choice just for the pleasure of having a debate with you. So what's the situation in Canada? Steve Kirsch has put up $1 million US, and he says to Dr. Rasmussen, if you come for 4 hours in a public videotaped debate, I'll give you $1 million. And so Dr. Rasmussen, has come back. And on the one hand, she kind of said, you know, I won't do it. There's only one problem with this whole situation is I'm not a grifter. So she kind of said, well, I'm not a grifter, so I won't do this. Then, to be clear, she also sort of changes her position, comes back and says, no, all right. If this thing is going to be public, if it's going to be broadcast and whatever, and if you agree to donate the money to the COVAX project, which is that UN project to get vaccines to poor countries, he said, you know, then maybe I'll consider it. So the situation right now, I think, is unclear. They both sort of have, you know, come forward, and they both seem to be sort of stepping around, but it's not clear where it's going. But to me, here's the actual story. We're 2 years into this thing. We keep getting the story from the government that we're just following the science. It's about the science. So just by example, I cannot find a single government report in a Western country anywhere that actually does a cost-benefit analysis of a lockdown and says, on a cost-benefit basis, the lockdowns were worth the effort. Same thing goes for the cost of the vaccine. Here in Canada, we're not even allowed to ask, how much did the vaccines cost? Because we're told, oh, well, you can't know that because it could interfere with our ability to buy more of them, sort of a thing. And just as another example, consider the convoy, the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. They set up a big thing with the doctors that were working for the convoy and said, we invite Dr. Tam and or her representative to come and show us the studies and the papers they're using to justify the new mandates cracking down on the truckers or any of the mandates at all that they put forward. Let them come, let them put the science on the table, and let's discuss it. And of course, they didn't even show up. So I kind of looked at that and you thought, wow, here the government of Canada had a chance to, you know, just flatten the convoy. They could have destroyed the convoy if Dr. Tam could have walked in there, put down 4 or 5 government studies and said, here's the study that shows the benefit, and this is why we're doing it. That would have just utterly destroyed the convoy, destroyed the mandates and everything. But of course, they didn't show. So with this current situation with Dr. Rasmussen from Saskatchewan and Dr. Malone and Mr. Steve Kirsch, I'm hoping this actually moves ahead. I would love to see an actual public debate between an informed scientist on one side, Dr. Malone, and a person who claims to have a lot of experience in virology and COVID and SARS-CoV and all that. In other words, Dr. Rasmussen on the other side. Hell, I'd pay big bucks to watch that if somebody wants to go ahead and sponsor it. So anyway, it would be nice to see these kinds of debates occurring, Mark, in Canada but we're not seeing them. So anyway, here's one that's developing. I hope it works, and let's keep an eye on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, wouldn't that be brilliant? But I mean, we're what, 2.5 years into this thing? Wouldn't these debates have taken back? I mean, and I realize we haven't had these vaccines available for that long, but you would think that these types of debates would have already taken place. I mean, millions of people have gotten their shots. They've gone on faith that they are safe, that they are effective. And now, of course, we've got people saying, well, it's time for your fourth shot now. And now we've got this rather interesting story. Not sure what to make of this one. The World Health Organization has contracted German-based Deutsche Telekom subsidiary T-Systems to, get this, develop a global vaccine passport system with plans to link every person on the planet to a QR code, a digital ID. Please share. This is from the Counter Signal. And so have you heard much about this? I mean, we've heard these types of accounts come up in the past, whereby this is really a plan to get everybody. The reason why they want shots in every arm is that they want to keep a log on people, that they want to surveil people. They want to keep track of you. They want to know who you are, where you are. And it's all part of a giant conspiracy to control people. To what degree do you put much faith in that?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, if you brought this stuff up 20 years ago, I mean, people did bring this stuff up 20 years ago, and they were called dystopian Hollywood movies about what a future would look like where the government would have a big giant computer that could control your life. And this is Orwellian kind of stuff. And I mean, that's exactly what George Orwell was on about, in 1948 when he published his book. Unfortunately, what we've seen through people like the World Economic Forum and through the World Health Organization, they keep coming out with these, oh, it's for your benefit. We can make medicine work better for you if we could just control everything you do. And of course, the flip side of this is what we've seen here in Canada right now. You can't get back into Canada as a Canadian without having the ArriveCan app, which of course needs to know, just strangely enough, where you live, who your relatives are, who are all the people you've met in the last 14 days, et cetera, et cetera. And, you can't travel. You can't even take the train right now in Canada from Ottawa to Toronto without being double vaxxed and being tracked and all this sort of stuff. So for folks who are skeptical, and put me in that camp, for folks who are skeptical that this is for your health, and who tend to believe this has a lot more to do with the social credit control system, the evidence is piling up that it's more to do with social control. Because if it was about the actual science behind it, or if it was about your health, my health, or whatever, I think they'd be much more forthcoming. So go back and look at guys like Bill Gates, look at the World Economic Forum. They're all talking about, oh, we'll put a chip in your arm or your hand or in your forehead or something. And then, it'll monitor your blood, it'll monitor your pressure. And it'll be all about helping us keep you healthy. But of course, it'll also be, oh, you didn't get your fourth booster shot, so you can't get on that airplane. Oh, you went to a protest against the fourth booster shot, so we're turning off your bank account, like, for instance. And, if you'd said that a year ago, people would have laughed and said, oh, the fact they'll turn off your bank account because they don't like you're doing, that's a conspiracy theory, Tom. Of course, it just happened here in Canada. If you oppose Mr. Trudeau, your bank account gets turned off, and your credit card and your PayPal and, whatever. And now, of course, they're coming after everything else. They want to come after your Bitcoin and whatever. So, yeah, unfortunately, I think the pandemic, there's sort of like, there's two problems. One is the actual problem. The government's not being clear. It's not being open. They're not providing the science so people can examine it. And they tell us, oh, the science is settled. Everything's good. Just believe it. So, of course, that's not science. Science is about asking questions. That's the whole idea behind science, is to challenge ideas. And we're being told, like Dr. Fauci in the States, if you're attacking me, you're attacking science. And it's like,
yeah,
it's not
that's
science.
right. I am science,
Yeah. And it's, it's I am God. It's like, no, you're not. You're not science. You're not God. You're not all knowing.
Exactly. You
That's
make
why
mistakes
we
just
have
like
science.
everybody else.
Yeah.
But here's the Globe and Mail lamenting about why Canadians are not rushing to get their shot, their booster shot. And so, you can well appreciate that the government now wants to take the next step, which is to say, okay, you've had, maybe 1-2 shots. That used to qualify as being fully vaxxed, no longer does. If you want to get on that airplane, you want to qualify to do all these other things, you need shot number 3 or else. And so now the Globe and Mail wringing its hands saying, come on, people, please get that third shot.
Yeah, so here's my way, a couple of ways of thinking about this. One is we're 2.5 years into this thing. We should be able to see some of the data now that's coming out of this, like how effective is the vaccine truly? What are the negative side effects of it? And there's nothing wrong with the vaccine having a negative side effect. They all do. The polio one did, the smallpox one did, no doubt this one will. But what are the degrees of negative impact, and what are they? Are they fertility? Are they blood clots? Are they heart problems? I mean, we hear all these stories, but we're not allowed to see the actual data, which is quite disturbing. And I think the other kind of problem here is, the companies pushing this stuff, and by this I mean Pfizer, Moderna, etc., still have immunity. They still are immune from any liability. So if they kill a whole bunch of people, you can't sue them because the government said you can't. It doesn't matter how many people they kill, you can't sue them because of the drug. And it's like there's no other drug or product out there. I mean, if Coca-Cola could get away with killing people by selling you, contaminated cans of Coke, I mean, they'd be sued, they'd be attacked, they'd be destroyed, their stock would go through the floor. But because you're a drug company pushing an mRNA vaccine, you're protected from liability. And people are questioning that, saying, how come these guys get protection on the one side and we're not allowed to question them on the other? If they want absolute immunity, then they should have, an absolute responsibility to explain what they're doing. In other words, the product has to go both ways. And of course, the other problem, as we mentioned earlier, here in Canada, we're not even allowed to ask, how much are we paying Pfizer for a shot of this stuff? Do we know? And the answer is we don't. You're left guessing that we're paying as much as the Americans, or maybe we're paying twice what the Americans paid. And if you ask, you're told, well, you're a bad person for asking, because if we reveal what we're paying, that could challenge our future strategy on getting a better deal later. And you're just kind of like, oh, give me a break. I mean, why aren't you telling us what's going on? So it's the same old problem, Mark. We've talked about this before. If government was reasonably transparent and reasonably effective and reasonably open, in other words, if they were accountable, then people would have a reasonable amount of faith in government like they used to. But when you get told, how much does a vaccine cost? And the answer is you're a racist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, misogynist, then you kind of say, wow, how come I'm getting attacked for asking a question?
Yeah.
And
well, I want to know who got the kickbacks. That's what I want. If they ever open up the books, then people are going to prison. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate this as always. I know our listeners, Saga 960, appreciate it as well.
Cheers. Thanks, Mark.
Tom Quiggin. All right, got to take a quick commercial break. Back with more on News Talk Saga 960 and the Mark Petrona Show after this.